Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're diving into something that I believe needs serious examination. T.D. Jakes' recent sermon titled, "Stay Steady in Life Storms and Conquer Fear That Holds You Back." Now, before we begin, I want to make it clear that this isn't a personal attack on Jakes himself, but rather a critical analysis of the ideas he's promoting and the potential harm they can cause. In a world where many are searching for answers, comfort, and direction, religious figures like T.D. Jakes offer seemingly simple solutions to complex problems. But what happens when these solutions actually prevent people from addressing the real issues in their lives? What if these teachings keep people trapped in cycles of magical thinking, rather than encouraging evidence-based approaches to life's challenges? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. I'll be breaking down key moments from this sermon and explaining why I believe these perspectives not only lack substantive evidence but may actually harm those who embrace them. So buckle up, this is going to be an eye-opening journey. Let's start with one of the most concerning ideas Jakes presents early in his sermon.
Because the stumble will let you know what you got wrong. The start doesn't tell you what you got wrong. The stumble tells you.
At first glance, this might seem like a positive reframing of suffering. Jakes is suggesting that pain serves a purpose. It's a warning system alerting us to problems that need attention. And yes, in a purely physiological sense, pain does serve as a warning mechanism in our bodies. But here's where things get problematic. This statement is part of a broader pattern in prosperity gospel teachings that reframes all suffering as somehow beneficial or divinely ordained. This perspective can be deeply harmful for several reasons. First, it creates a false dichotomy where pain must either be meaningless or divinely purposeful. The reality is much more nuanced. Some suffering is random.
The reason that I'm frustrated with David is because David should know better than to.
This quote exemplifies the spiritual warfare narrative that's prevalent in many evangelical and charismatic teachings. Let's break down why this perspective is problematic. First, it creates an external enemy for all life's difficulties. Rather than acknowledging that challenges often arise from complex, interconnected factors including random chance, personal choices, systemic issues, or natural consequences, this perspective attributes setbacks to deliberate spiritual attacks. This demonization of everyday problems can prevent people from addressing the actual causes of their struggles. Second, it promotes a narcissistic worldview where supernatural forces are constantly focused on the individual believer. Think about it, this perspective suggests that invisible entities are monitoring your progress and strategically timing their attacks to maximize damage in your life. It places the believer at the center of a cosmic battle, which can foster an unhealthy self-importance. Third, and perhaps most concerning, is how this teaching creates a perpetual state of fear and hypervigilance. If all hell breaks loose, whenever you're close to success, and these attacks specifically target what you love, you're encouraged to see potential threats everywhere. This constant state of spiritual paranoia is exhausting and prevents people from living fully present, rational lives. Fourth, this perspective makes falsifiable claims that conveniently can never be disproven. If something good happens, it's God's blessing. If something bad happens, it's spiritual warfare. If nothing happens, it's God's timing or protection. This closed system of thought immunizes itself against critical examination, a hallmark of manipulative ideologies. Let me be clear, I'm not saying people shouldn't have spiritual beliefs. But when those beliefs create frameworks that prevent rational analysis of life's challenges and promote constant fear of invisible attacks, they become harmful rather than helpful. Next, let's examine one of the most manipulative aspects of this sermon.
I had to stop you right here and correct it before you go a step further. So we dealt with the start, we dealt with the stumble, and then came the...
This statement might sound profound, but it's actually a classic thought-terminating cliché used to shut down critical thinking. Let's analyze why this is problematic. First, it creates an unfalsifiable claim. If you don't believe in the devil, that itself becomes evidence that you've been deceived by the devil. This circular reasoning makes the belief system impervious to questioning, a red flag for any ideology. Second, it weaponizes skepticism against the skeptic. Rather than engaging with reasonable doubts or alternative explanations, this perspective pathologizes critical thinking. You're not thinking clearly, you're being deceived, becomes the default response to legitimate questions. Third, it establishes a false dichotomy. Either you accept the entire spiritual warfare narrative, or you're unwittingly serving the enemy's purposes. This black and white thinking leaves no room for nuance or partial agreement. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, this perspective shifts the burden of proof in an intellectually dishonest way. In rational discourse, the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. If someone claims invisible entities are attacking people, they should provide evidence. Instead, this quote suggests that the absence of belief itself is evidence of the claim's truth. This rhetorical technique has been used throughout history to maintain control and prevent questioning of authority. From political regimes claiming only enemies of the state would question our methods, to cults insisting that doubts are planted by negative forces. This approach serves to isolate believers and discourage critical examination. What's particularly interesting is how this quote actually inverts the famous line attributed to Charles Baudelaire and popularized in The Usual Suspects. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Jakes is tapping into a well-established rhetorical device that has been used for centuries to maintain belief in the face of increasing skepticism. Let's continue with another problematic teaching.
Lord, I thank you for who didn't touch me. Lord, I thank you for who didn't rape me. Lord, I thank you for who didn't destroy me. I thank you for the disease I didn't get. I thank you for the pain I didn't have to bear. I thank you for the emptiness I didn't go through. I thank you how you kept my mind.
This quote represents a perspective that undermines personal agency and creates unhealthy social dynamics. Here's why. First, it diminishes personal responsibility and growth. By attributing resilience entirely to divine protection rather than personal strength, choices, or developed coping skills, this teaching discourages people from recognizing their own capacity for growth and change. It suggests that success in overcoming challenges is not about developing resilience, but simply receiving divine favor. Second, it creates an unhealthy framework for understanding others' struggles. If my success is due to God's hedge of protection, rather than my choices or efforts, then by extension, others' failures must be due to God's decision not to protect them. This perspective can lead to a subtle, or not so subtle, spiritual superiority complex. God protected me, but not them. Third, it fosters magical thinking rather than practical action. Instead of encouraging people to develop healthy coping mechanisms, seek appropriate help, or make wise choices, this teaching suggests that divine protection is the primary factor in determining outcomes. This can lead to passive approaches to life's challenges rather than proactive problem solving. Fourth, it creates impossible questions about divine favoritism. If God places a hedge around some people but not others, what does this say about God's character? Why would some receive protection while others suffer? This teaching inadvertently portrays God as arbitrary and capricious, rather than just and loving. Fifth, it misappropriates the biblical story of Job, which actually demonstrates the opposite point. In Job's story, the hedge is temporarily removed specifically to test Job's character, suggesting that true spiritual strength is revealed precisely when divine protection is absent, not when it's present. This teaching ultimately creates a disempowering framework where believers attribute their successes to external forces, God's protection, while potentially judging others who struggle as lacking divine favor. It's a perspective that can foster both spiritual pride and learned helplessness. Finally, let's examine Jake's perspective on fear.
Samaria would never reach its potential if Simon was alive.
This metaphor comparing fears to scarecrows seems insightful at first glance. Jake suggests that many fears are harmless illusions that have power only because we give them power. And there's a kernel of truth here. Some fears are indeed exaggerated or irrational. However, this oversimplification of fear is problematic for several reasons. First, it dismisses the reality of legitimate fears. Not all fears are imaginary scarecrows. Some fears are based on real threats and serve as important protective mechanisms. Teaching people to dismiss all fears as illusions can leave them vulnerable to actual dangers. Second, it trivializes complex psychological conditions. For those suffering from clinical anxiety disorders, PTSD, or phobias, fear isn't simply an illusion they can choose to ignore. These conditions involve complex neurobiological processes that often require professional treatment. Suggesting that people can simply recognize their fears as scarecrows and move past them is dangerously reductive. Third, it places undue burden on individuals struggling with fear. This perspective suggests that if you continue to experience fear, it's because you're choosing to give it power, essentially blaming the person for their continued suffering. This can lead to shame and self-blame when people can't simply overcome their fears through willpower. Fourth, it ignores systemic and structural sources of fear. Many fears, particularly from marginalized communities, stem from very real experiences of discrimination, violence, or injustice. Characterizing these fears as mere scarecrows dismisses the legitimate concerns of vulnerable populations and ignores the need for systemic change. A more responsible approach would acknowledge that while some fears may be exaggerated, others are legitimate responses to real threats. It would recognize the complexity of fear responses and encourage appropriate help seeking, rather than suggesting a one-size-fits-all spiritual solution. Now that we've examined specific quotes from Jake's sermon, let's step back and look at the broader theological framework underpinning these teachings. T.D. Jakes is often associated with the prosperity gospel, a theological perspective that emphasizes God's desire to bless believers with health, wealth, and success. This theological framework presents several significant problems. The prosperity gospel often frames faith as a transaction. If you believe correctly, pray correctly, and give correctly, God will reward you with material blessings. This turns faith into a spiritual vending machine, rather than a relationship based on love and trust. It reduces God to a cosmic ATM and prayer to a withdrawal slip. Throughout most of Christian history, suffering was understood as an expected part of the faithful life, not as evidence of insufficient faith. Jesus himself promised his followers would face tribulation, not prosperity. The early church was characterized by persecution, not privilege. The prosperity gospel represents a significant departure from traditional Christian theology. When people are taught that faith should result in prosperity, what happens when they face financial hardship, illness, or tragedy despite their faithful prayers? The prosperity gospel leaves only two options. Either God has failed them, or their faith was insufficient. Both conclusions can be spiritually devastating. The prosperity gospel often finds its strongest foothold among those who are already economically vulnerable. The promise that faith can lead to financial blessing becomes particularly appealing to those struggling financially. This can lead to exploitation when these teachings are paired with calls for sacrificial giving to religious organizations. Many prosperity gospel teachings take passages from ancient Near Eastern texts and interpret them through the lens of modern American capitalism and individualism. This approach ignores the historical and cultural context of the biblical texts and imposes contemporary values onto ancient writings. Beyond theological concerns, sermons like Jake's can have significant psychological impacts on listeners. Let's examine some of these effects. Teachings that attribute life events to invisible spiritual forces, rather than identifiable causes, can promote magical thinking over critical analysis. This can prevent people from developing healthy problem-solving skills and realistic assessments of their situations. When successes are attributed to divine intervention and failures to spiritual attack, believers develop what psychologists call an external locus of control. The belief that their lives are primarily controlled by outside forces rather than their own choices and actions. Research consistently shows that an external locus of control is associated with higher levels of anxiety and depression. The spiritual warfare narrative creates a state of constant vigilance against potential attacks. This hypervigilance, when sustained over time, can contribute to anxiety disorders, sleep disruption, and even symptoms similar to PTSD. Perhaps most concerning is how these teachings can delay appropriate help seeking. When mental health struggles are framed as spiritual warfare rather than psychological conditions, people may seek spiritual solutions rather than evidence-based treatments, potentially allowing treatable conditions to worsen. Beyond individual psychological effects, teachings like those in Jake's sermon can impact how communities function. The spiritual warfare narrative often creates sharp distinctions between believers who recognize the real spiritual battle and non-believers who are either deceived or part of the problem. This can lead to unhealthy isolation of religious communities from broader society. When problems are attributed to spiritual forces rather than systemic issues, it can discourage believers from engaging in efforts to address structural injustices. Why work for systemic change if the real problem is spiritual warfare? The belief that some people receive divine protection, while others don't, can foster judgmental attitudes toward those experiencing hardship. Their suffering may be interpreted as evidence of spiritual failure, rather than the result of complex life circumstances. When religious leaders claim special spiritual insight into invisible warfare, it can create unhealthy power dynamics where questioning the leader is equated with siding with spiritual enemies. This environment can enable abusive leadership practices with minimal accountability. It's important to note that not all religious teachings promote these problematic perspectives. Many theological traditions offer more balanced approaches that 1. Acknowledge the reality of suffering without attributing all suffering to spiritual attacks. 2. Encourage both faith and practical action in response to challenges. 3. Recognize the value of evidence-based, approaches to mental and physical health. 4. Promote critical thinking alongside spiritual growth. 5. Address systemic injustices rather than focusing exclusively on spiritual explanations. These more balanced approaches allow for spiritual meaning, while still encouraging responsible engagement with the complexities of human experience. We can't fully analyze T.D. Jakes' ministry without acknowledging the financial dimension. Jakes has built a multi-million-dollar empire through his ministry, books, films, and other ventures. This raises important questions about the relationship between his teachings and his financial success. The prosperity gospel creates a particularly problematic dynamic. The preacher's wealth becomes evidence that the teachings work. If you want to be blessed like me, follow these principles becomes an implicit or explicit message. This creates a self-reinforcing system where financial success validates the teaching, which in turn generates more financial success for the teacher. This isn't to suggest that all religious leaders should take vows of poverty or that earning income from ministry is inherently problematic. However, when teachings about divine blessing and prosperity come from someone personally profiting from those very teachings, it creates an undeniable conflict of interest that deserves critical examination. To understand why teachings like Jakes find such fertile ground in America, we need to consider the historical context. The prosperity gospel didn't emerge in a vacuum. It represents the marriage of certain Christian teachings with distinctly American cultural values. American culture has long emphasized optimism, self-determination, and material success as evidence of moral virtue. From the Puritan work ethic to the Gilded Age to modern consumer capitalism, there's a persistent thread in American culture that connects material prosperity with divine favor and moral character. The prosperity gospel effectively baptizes these cultural values in religious language. It transforms the American dream into a divine promise, reframing capitalist success as spiritual blessing. This explains why these teachings find particular resonance in American contexts, while being viewed more skeptically in other parts of the global Christian community. Understanding this historical and cultural context helps us see that what's presented as timeless biblical truth is often heavily influenced by contemporary cultural values and economic systems. Another critical issue underlying sermons like Jakes is the question of interpretive authority. When Jakes makes claims about spiritual warfare or divine protection, he's interpreting ancient texts for a modern audience. This raises important questions about how we determine reliable interpretations. In academic biblical scholarship, interpretations are subject to peer review, methodological scrutiny, and historical critical analysis. Claims must be supported by evidence and stand up to rigorous examination. But in many religious contexts, charismatic authority often trumps methodological rigor. The preacher's confidence, rhetorical skill, and claimed spiritual insight become the basis for accepting interpretations rather than sound methodology. This creates a dangerous situation where compelling speakers can promote interpretations that serve their interests or confirm their biases with minimal accountability. Without robust interpretive standards, how can listeners distinguish between sound teaching and manipulative misinterpretation? Prosperity gospel teachings are often supported by testimonials, stories of people who prayed, believed, gave, and subsequently received blessings. These powerful anecdotes serve as evidence that the teachings work. But this approach has serious methodological flaws. 1. Selection bias. We only hear the success stories, not the countless cases where similar faith didn't produce similar results. 2. Confirmation bias. People naturally remember and emphasize experiences that confirm their existing beliefs while forgetting or reinterpreting contradictory experiences. 3. Post hoc fallacy. When good things happen after prayer or giving, it's assumed the spiritual action caused the positive outcome, ignoring other potential causes. 4. Survivorship bias. We hear from those who survived and thrived, not from those who followed the same teachings but experienced continued hardship or left the faith altogether. Testimonials can be powerful and emotionally moving, but they're not reliable evidence for causal claims. When life-altering decisions about health, finances, and well-being are based on testimonial evidence rather than systematic analysis, the potential for harm increases significantly. One defense often offered for teachings like Jake's is that they're meant metaphorically rather than literally. The spiritual warfare narrative might be understood as a metaphorical framework for discussing life's challenges, rather than claims about actual invisible entities. The problem is that this distinction is rarely made clear to audiences. Preachers like Jake's often speak about demons, spiritual attacks, and divine protection in ways that strongly suggest literal belief. Listeners are encouraged to act as if these entities and forces are literally real, not merely metaphorical. This creates a problematic ambiguity where teachings can be defended as metaphorical when critiqued, but presented as literal when preached. This rhetorical slipperiness makes critical engagement difficult and allows potentially harmful ideas to spread under the protection of metaphorical interpretation. All of this raises profound ethical questions about responsibility in religious teaching. If a preacher promotes ideas that 1. Discourage appropriate medical or psychological help seeking. 2. Foster unhealthy fear and hypervigilance. 3. Attribute suffering to spiritual failure rather than complex causes. 4. Create financial incentives for the teacher while placing financial burdens on followers. What ethical responsibility do they bear for the consequences of these teachings? While we strongly believe in freedom of religion and speech, we must also acknowledge that influential religious teachers have significant power to shape followers' worldviews and decisions. With this power comes responsibility that's rarely acknowledged in discussions of religious teaching. I want to be clear that my critique of Jake's sermon isn't an attack on faith or spirituality broadly. Rather, it's a call for more thoughtful, evidence-informed, and ethically responsible approaches to spirituality. Many faith traditions offer frameworks that 1. Encourage critical thinking alongside faith. 2. Integrate spiritual perspectives with evidence-based approaches to health and well-being. 3. Address both personal and systemic dimensions of human suffering. 4. Acknowledge the complexity and ambiguity of life, rather than offering oversimplified explanations. 5. Promote compassion rather than judgment toward those experiencing hardship. These more balanced approaches offer the meaning and community that draw people to faith without the harmful elements we've identified in prosperity gospel teachings. As we conclude this analysis, I want to emphasize that my goal isn't to strip away hope or meaning from people's lives. Rather, it's to encourage approaches to life's challenges that integrate the best of both spiritual wisdom and evidence-based understanding. The real tragedy of teachings like those in Jake's sermon isn't that they offer spiritual perspectives. It's that they offer harmful spiritual perspectives that can prevent people from addressing their challenges effectively. Life is complex. Suffering is multifaceted. Our approaches to these realities should be equally nuanced. We don't need to choose between spiritual meaning and critical thinking. The most robust approaches to life integrate both. If you've been influenced by teachings like those we've analyzed today, I encourage you to explore more balanced perspectives that honor both faith and reason. Your spiritual journey doesn't have to come at the expense of critical thinking, nor does critical thinking need to eliminate meaningful spirituality. If you found this analysis helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more critical examinations of influential teachings. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, whether you agree, disagree, or have questions about anything discussed today. Also, if you have suggestions for other sermons or teachings you'd like to see analyzed, drop those in the comments as well. This conversation is important, and your engagement helps it reach more people who might benefit. Finally, if you know someone who might find this analysis valuable, please share it with them. Sometimes the most caring thing we can do is offer alternative perspectives that might help people break free from harmful thought patterns. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.